The rain was coming down in sheets as I sat in my car outside 412 Oak Street, staring at the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of what should have been my children's dream home. Through the blur of water on my windshield, I could see silhouettes moving inside, hear the distant sound of laughter and conversation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was supposed to be Marcus and Riley's housewarming party, the celebration of their new beginning together as siblings who'd finally bought a place side by side in Riverside Heights. I had driven 45 minutes from Pine Valley with a homemade casserole still warm in the passenger seat and a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. But when I'd knocked on that cheerful red door just 20 minutes ago, my own son Marcus had opened it with a look of genuine surprise that quickly shifted to something I'd never seen before in his eyes: cold disappointment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he'd asked, not moving aside to let me in, even as the October chill swept around us both. "It's your housewarming party, sweetheart. I brought your favorite green bean casserole and, sorry, you weren't invited. You should go home." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Behind him, I could see Riley appear in the hallway, her face flushing red when she spotted me standing there in the rain. She didn't say anything, just looked down at her feet like she was 16 again, and had been caught sneaking out past curfew. The sounds of the party continued behind them. Friends and what I assumed were neighbors chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the drama unfolding at the front door. I'm Jessica Coleman, and 6 months ago, I would have told you I had the perfect relationship with my 2 adult children. At 53, I thought I'd done everything right as a mother. I'd supported them through college, been there for every major milestone, never missed a birthday or holiday. Ben, my late husband and their father, used to joke that I was the kind of mom who would drop everything to help her kids, even when they didn't ask for it. He wasn't wrong. When Marcus was going through his divorce 3 years ago, I spent countless evenings listening to him cry over the phone, bringing him home-cooked meals when I knew he was surviving on takeout and heartbreak. When Riley was struggling to start her photography business, I was her first client, hiring her to document every family gathering even when I couldn't really afford it. After Ben died 4 years ago from a sudden heart attack, the kids and I had grown even closer. We were all we had left, the 3 musketeers against the world, as Riley used to say. We had weekly dinners at my house in Pine Valley, long phone conversations about everything and nothing, and I was the first person they called with both good news and bad. That's why sitting in this car now, watching their housewarming party continue without me, felt like living in some kind of alternate reality. The casserole was getting cold, and the windows were starting to fog up from my breathing and the temperature difference between inside and outside the car. I should have driven home. Any reasonable person would have accepted the rejection, licked their wounds privately, and maybe called tomorrow to ask what had gone wrong. But something about the way Marcus had looked at me, the way Riley couldn't meet my eyes, told me there was more to this story than a simple oversight in invitation planning. I had to know what I'd done wrong. Growing up, I'd always prided myself on being the kind of mother my own mother never was. Margaret Coleman had been distant, critical, more concerned with appearances than actual relationships. She was the type of woman who would criticize your outfit while you were wearing it, and wonder aloud why you couldn't be more like the neighbor's daughter who was a doctor. When I married Ben at 25, I'd sworn I would never make my children feel the way my mother had made me feel. Unwanted. Burdensome. Like love was something you had to earn through perfect behavior and constant achievement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ben and I had been married for 24 years when he passed, and in that time, we'd built what I thought was a warm, open family dynamic. We encouraged the kids to bring friends over to talk to us about their problems, to see our house as a safe haven from the pressures of the outside world. Even when money was tight, we made sure there was always food on the table for whoever needed it, and an open-door policy that extended to friends, classmates, and later, college roommates and romantic partners. Marcus was our firstborn, arriving after 3 years of trying, and one heartbreaking miscarriage that had nearly destroyed my faith in becoming a mother at all. From the moment he entered the world, he was serious, thoughtful, the kind of child who would spend hours building elaborate structures with blocks, and then carefully explain to anyone who would listen how each piece fit together. He grew up to be an engineer, which surprised no one, and had always been the type to think through problems methodically before making decisions. He'd inherited Ben's logical mind and my stubborn streak, a combination that served him well professionally but sometimes made him inflexible in personal relationships. Riley came along 2 years later, a whirlwind of energy and creativity, who never met a stranger. Where Marcus was cautious and analytical, Riley was impulsive and emotional, the kind of person who would cry at commercials and adopt stray cats without thinking about the consequences. She'd gotten Ben's easy laugh and my tendency to wear my heart on my sleeve, which made her incredibly empathetic but also easily hurt by the world around her. As a photographer, she had an eye for capturing moments that other people missed, the quiet expressions between words, the way light fell across someone's face when they thought no one was looking. Despite their different personalities, Marcus and Riley had always been close. They'd gone through their teenage years without the typical sibling rivalry that seemed to plague other families, and as adults, they'd maintained a friendship that went beyond mere family obligation. When Marcus was going through his divorce, Riley had been the one to convince him to stay in Riverside Heights instead of moving across the country for a fresh start. She'd argued that family was more important than geography, and that running away from problems never actually solved anything. That's what made their joint decision to buy houses next to each other so perfect. Marcus had found a beautiful craftsman-style home on Oak Street, and when the house next door went up for sale 6 months later, Riley had jumped at the chance to be his neighbor. They'd coordinated their moving dates, planned to share holiday hosting duties, and talked about how wonderful it would be to have built-in babysitters when they eventually had children. It was exactly the kind of close-knit family arrangement that Ben and I had always dreamed our children would create. Which is why being excluded from their housewarming party felt like such a betrayal. I'd learned about the party the way any mother fears learning about important events in her children's lives, by accident. Linda, my closest friend and walking partner, had mentioned seeing something on Riley's Instagram about a housewarming celebration. She'd assumed I already knew, had asked casually if I needed help with food preparation or decorating. The confusion on my face must have been obvious because she'd immediately pulled out her phone to show me the post. There it was, a beautifully staged photo of both houses with autumn decorations and a caption that read, "Can't wait to celebrate our new neighborhood with friends and family this Saturday. So grateful for everyone who supported us on this journey." The comments were full of excited responses from people I knew, people who'd been at Marcus and Riley's birthday parties and graduation celebrations, people who'd sat at my dining room table and complimented my cooking. My first instinct had been to assume it was an oversight. Maybe they'd meant to call me and gotten busy with work. Maybe they'd sent an invitation that had gotten lost in the mail. I'd decided to surprise them by showing up with food, the way I'd done for countless other celebrations over the years. It never occurred to me that my presence would be unwelcome. But sitting in that car, watching the party continue without me, I started to replay the last few months of our relationship, looking for clues I might have missed. Had there been signs that something was wrong? Conversations that had felt stilted or forced? Plans that had been made without including me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that our weekly dinners had become less frequent sometime in the spring. What had once been a standing Sunday tradition had shifted to every other week, then to whenever we could find time that worked for everyone. I'd attributed it to their busy schedules, the stress of house hunting and mortgage applications, the general chaos of adult life. It never occurred to me that they might be pulling away intentionally. Our phone conversations had changed too, now that I was really analyzing them. Where we used to talk for hours about everything from work drama to dating struggles to random thoughts about life, our recent calls had been shorter, more focused on logistics and schedules. When was the closing date? Did they need help moving? Had they picked out paint colors yet? The deeper, more personal conversations that had been the foundation of our relationship seemed to have evaporated without my noticing. Even our text message threads, which used to be full of funny memes and photos and random updates throughout the day, had become perfunctory. Good morning messages and responses to direct questions, but none of the spontaneous sharing that had once made me feel like I was still a central part of their lives. How had I missed all of this? How had I been so blind to the growing distance between us? The rain was starting to let up, and I could see more clearly through the windows of Marcus's house. There were definitely more people there than I'd initially realized, maybe 30 or 40 guests scattered throughout the visible rooms. I recognized some faces. Connor, Marcus's new boyfriend who worked in marketing and always wore perfectly coordinated outfits. Sophie, Riley's girlfriend who taught elementary school and had the most infectious laugh. Several of their college friends who'd stayed in the area after graduation, and what looked like some neighbors and coworkers. What struck me most was how natural everyone looked together, how comfortable and relaxed the whole gathering seemed. This wasn't a hastily thrown-together party or a small, intimate gathering. This was a real celebration, something that had been planned and organized and anticipated. Which meant my exclusion hadn't been an accident or oversight. It had been a deliberate choice. I watched Riley move through the crowd with a tray of appetizers, stopping to chat with different groups. Her face bright with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen from her in months. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress that I'd helped her pick out during our last shopping trip together, and her dark hair was styled in loose waves that caught the light every time she turned her head. She looked beautiful and confident and settled in a way that made my heart ache with both pride and loss. Marcus was holding court near what I assumed was the fireplace, gesturing animatedly while telling some story that had his audience laughing. He'd inherited Ben's gift for storytelling, the ability to make even mundane experiences sound fascinating through careful pacing and well-timed humor. He was wearing the navy blue sweater I'd given him for his birthday last year, and for a moment, the familiar side of it made me forget where I was and why I was sitting outside in the rain, instead of inside sharing his joy. That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. On the mantel behind Marcus, clearly visible through the window, was a collection of framed photographs. Family photos, I assumed, the kind of carefully curated collection that people display when they want to show visitors what matters most to them. But from what I could see, even at this distance, none of those photos included me. I'd been erased from their narrative completely. The realization hit me like a physical blow, making me gasp out loud in the silence of my car. This wasn't just about a missed invitation or a miscommunication about party planning. This was about something much deeper and more painful. Somehow, at some point that I couldn't pinpoint, I had become persona non grata in my own children's lives. But why? What had I done that was so terrible it warranted this kind of complete exclusion? I'd supported them through every major life change, celebrated their successes, comforted them through their failures. I'd been the kind of mother who showed up, who remembered important dates, who made their favorite foods when they were sad and bought thoughtful gifts for birthdays and holidays. I'd never been perfect, but I'd tried my best to love them unconditionally and give them the kind of childhood I'd wished for myself. Had I been too involved? Too supportive? Was there such a thing as loving your children too much? I thought about the last time I'd spoken to each of them individually. Marcus had called 3 weeks ago to tell me about a promotion at work, and we'd talked for maybe 15 minutes about his new responsibilities and the raise that came with them. The conversation had felt normal at the time, but now I wondered if there had been something distant in his tone, something that suggested he was sharing good news out of obligation rather than genuine excitement to tell me about his life. Riley had texted me just last week to thank me for the birthday card I'd sent to Connor, a gesture I'd made because I wanted him to feel welcomed into our family. Her response had been brief but warm. "That was so sweet of you, Mom." Connor was really touched. But when I'd suggested we all have dinner together soon to celebrate, she'd said they were really busy with work and house stuff, but maybe in a few weeks. Now I wondered if busy had been code for trying to figure out how to avoid spending time with you. The party sounds were getting louder, and I could see people moving toward what must have been the dining room. Dinner time, probably, which meant I'd been sitting in this car for over an hour, trying to make sense of a situation that felt completely surreal. The casserole in my passenger seat had long since gone cold, and the champagne bottle was now just a mockery of my assumptions about how this evening would go. I should leave. I knew that. Sitting here watching my children's lives continue without me was both pathetic and potentially creepy. If anyone noticed me parked across the street, They might call the police, or at the very least mention to Marcus and Riley that their mother had been lurking outside their party like some kind of stalker. But I couldn't bring myself to start the engine and drive back to my empty house in Pine Valley, where I would spend the rest of the evening wondering what I'd done wrong and whether there was any way to fix it. Instead, I found myself thinking about Ben and what he would say if he were here. He'd always been the voice of reason in our family, the one who could step back from emotional situations and see them clearly. When the kids were teenagers and I would get frustrated with their attitude or behavior, he would remind me that adolescence was temporary, and that our job was to love them through it, not to take their rejection personally. When they were young adults making choices I didn't understand or approve of, he would encourage me to trust that we'd raise them well, and that they would find their way. But Ben had never had to deal with being completely shut out of their lives. He died while we were still the close-knit family unit we'd always been, while Sunday dinners were still sacred, and phone calls were still frequent, and holidays were still planned around everyone's schedules. He'd never had to wonder if his love was unwanted, or if his presence was more burden than blessing. What would he tell me to do now? Would he encourage me to respect their boundaries and wait for them to reach out when they were ready? Would he suggest I fight for the relationship, demand an explanation, refuse to accept this rejection without understanding its cause? Would he remind me that love sometimes means letting go, even when letting go feels impossible? I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes, trying to channel some of Ben's wisdom across the 4 years since he'd been gone. But all I could hear was the sound of rain on the roof of my car and the distant sound of my children's laughter floating through windows I was no longer welcome to enter. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to drive home and pretend this hadn't happened. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd done wrong, or accepting that this was just how things were now. I was going to find out the truth, even if it hurt, even if it meant confronting some uncomfortable realities about myself or my relationships, or the kind of mother I'd actually been versus the kind of mother I'd thought I was. But first, I needed to go home and think. I needed to look back through the last few months with clear eyes, searching for the moments when things had started to change. I needed to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened, and what role I might have played in pushing my own children away. I started the car and took one last look at the warm, welcoming house that should have included me. Through the window, I could see Marcus raising a glass in what looked like a toast, his face bright with happiness and love for all the people who'd gathered to celebrate this new chapter in his life. Riley was standing beside him, her arm linked through Sophie's, her smile radiant in the golden light. They looked complete without me. That was perhaps the most painful realization of all. Whatever had driven them to exclude me from this celebration, they didn't seem to be suffering for my absence. Their joy was genuine and unforced, unmarred by guilt or second thoughts about the choice they'd made. As I drove through the quiet streets of Riverside Heights toward the highway that would take me back to Pine Valley, I made myself a promise. I was going to figure out what had gone wrong between us, and I was going to find a way to fix it. I wasn't ready to accept that the close relationship I'd cherished with my children was over, that I'd been relegated to the role of distant relative who gets Christmas cards but not dinner invitations. But I also wasn't going to approach this like the mother I'd been before, the one who showed up uninvited and assumed her presence was always welcome. I was going to be smarter, more strategic, more honest about my own shortcomings, and more respectful of their autonomy. I was going to earn my way back into their lives, if that was possible, rather than demanding entry based on biology and history. The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached the highway, and for the first time in hours I felt something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. It was determination, mixed with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes from having your assumptions completely shattered. I didn't know what I was going to discover about myself, or my relationship with Marcus and Riley. I didn't know if whatever had driven us apart could be repaired, or if I was about to learn things about myself that would be difficult to accept. But I knew I couldn't move forward until I understood what had brought me to this moment, sitting alone in my car outside my children's celebration, feeling like a stranger in my own family's story. The next few weeks were going to be difficult, but they were also going to be illuminating. And maybe, if I was very lucky and very honest and very willing to change whatever needed changing, they might also be the beginning of something better than what we'd had before. The drive back to Pine Valley felt longer than usual, each mile giving me more time to dissect every interaction I'd had with Marcus and Riley over the past year. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the small ranch house I'd called home for the past 15 years looked different somehow. Lonelier. The porch light I'd left on seemed dimmer, and the autumn decorations I'd put up just last week felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The dining room table was set for one, a habit I'd developed after Ben died, because eating at the kitchen counter made me feel too much like I was just surviving rather than living. The living room still had photos of Marcus and Riley at various ages covering every available surface, a shrine to motherhood that now felt almost embarrassing in its obviousness. Had I been holding on to a version of our relationship that had stopped existing years ago? I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into Ben's old armchair, the one I'd never been able to bring myself to replace even though the fabric was wearing thin and it didn't match anything else in the room. This was where I did my best thinking, where I'd worked through every major decision since his death. Tonight, I needed to go back to the beginning and trace the evolution of my relationships with my children, looking for the moment when things had started to shift. Marcus had been born when I was 27, after Ben and I had been married for 3 years. Those early years of parenthood had been a mixture of exhaustion and joy that I wouldn't trade for anything. Ben worked long hours at the engineering firm, trying to establish himself in his career, which meant I handled most of the day-to-day parenting responsibilities. I didn't mind. In fact, I loved being needed so completely, loved being the center of someone's universe in a way I'd never experienced before. When Riley came along 2 years later, our family dynamic shifted but remained harmonious. Marcus adapted to being a big brother with the same thoughtful consideration he approached everything else, helping me with diaper changes and bottle feedings like a tiny assistant. Riley, from the moment she could focus her eyes, was fascinated by her brother, watching his every move with the kind of attention that would later serve her well as a photographer. Those early years established patterns that I now realized had continued well into their adulthood. I was the problem solver, the one who anticipated needs before they were expressed. When Marcus was 6 and started having nightmares about monsters in his closet, I didn't just comfort him. I researched child psychology articles about nighttime fears, bought a special nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling, and created an elaborate bedtime ritual that included checking every corner of his room for imaginary threats. When Riley was 5 and decided she wanted to learn piano, I didn't just find her a teacher. I researched different pedagogical approaches, bought the best beginner keyboard I could afford, and rearranged the living room to create a dedicated practice space. Ben used to tease me about being an overachiever as a mother, but he said it with affection and pride. He'd grown up with parents who were loving but hands-off, the kind of people who expected children to figure things out on their own. My approach was the opposite. I wanted to smooth every rough edge, anticipate every need, create a childhood for my kids that was so secure and supported they would never question whether they were loved. Looking back now, I wondered if my good intentions had created a different kind of problem. Had I been so focused on being the perfect mother that I'd never taught my children how to navigate challenges independently? Had I made myself so essential to their lives that they'd never learned to see me as a separate person with my own needs and limitations? The teenage years had been surprisingly smooth in our household. While other parents complained about surly adolescence and slammed doors, Marcus and Riley had remained communicative and relatively compliant. They brought friends over regularly, included me in their conversations, asked for advice about everything from college applications to relationship drama. I had attributed this to the strong foundation we'd built during their childhood, the open communication and unconditional support that had made our house feel safe. But now I wondered if there was another explanation. Maybe they'd been so accustomed to my involvement that they hadn't known how to establish appropriate boundaries. Maybe what I'd interpreted as closeness had actually been a kind of enmeshment that they'd only recognized as problematic once they'd gotten older and gained perspective. Marcus had gone to State University for engineering, close enough that he could come home on weekends, but far enough that he had to learn some independence. I'd visited campus exactly once during his 4 years there, and only because he'd been in the hospital with appendicitis and needed someone to advocate for him with the medical staff. Even then, I'd stayed for just 2 days, long enough to make sure he was recovering properly and had everything he needed for the next few weeks. I'd been proud of my restraint, proud of the way I'd managed to support him without being intrusive. He'd called me regularly throughout college, shared stories about his classes and friends, and the engineering projects that excited him. When he'd brought girlfriends home for holidays, I'd made an effort to welcome them without being overwhelming, to ask questions that showed interest without crossing into interrogation territory. Riley had chosen a school 3 hours away, far enough that weekend visits weren't practical but close enough for regular phone contact. She'd majored in art with a focus on photography, a choice that had worried me initially because of the financial uncertainty that came with creative careers. But I'd kept my concerns to myself, trusting that she was following her passion and would find a way to make it work. Both kids had graduated and found jobs in their respective fields without needing financial support beyond what Ben and I had already provided through their college educations. Marcus had been hired by a respected engineering firm in Riverside Heights, and Riley had started building her photography business while working part-time at a local gallery. They'd seemed happy and independent and proud of what they were accomplishing. When had that started to change? When had my supportive presence begun to feel burdensome rather than helpful? I got up to refill my wine glass and found myself standing in front of the refrigerator, looking at the collection of photos and magnets and appointment cards that covered every inch of the surface. Most of the photos were of Marcus and Riley, documenting everything from first steps to graduation ceremonies. There were pictures from family vacations, holiday celebrations, random moments that had seemed worth preserving at the time. But as I studied them more carefully, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. In almost every photo where we were all together, I was positioned in the center, with Marcus and Riley flanking me on either side. Even in candid shots, I seemed to be the focal point, the one everyone else was oriented toward. When had I become the sun that my children orbited around, rather than simply one member of a constellation? Ben's death 4 years ago had intensified this dynamic in ways I was only now beginning to understand. Suddenly, I wasn't just their mother. I was their only surviving parent, the keeper of family history and traditions, the one who needed extra support and attention during the grieving process. Marcus and Riley had both stepped up beautifully during those dark months, calling more frequently, visiting more often, including me in their plans and decisions in ways that made me feel less alone. But maybe that increased closeness had crossed a line somewhere. Maybe they'd started to feel responsible for my emotional well-being in ways that were unhealthy for all of us. Maybe they'd begun to see me not as their independent, capable mother, but as someone who needed to be managed and accommodated and protected from additional loss. I thought about the months immediately after Ben's funeral, when I'd struggled to do basic things like grocery shopping and paying bills. The tasks themselves weren't difficult, but the simple act of making decisions without his input had felt overwhelming. Should I buy the expensive cereal that Marcus liked? Or was that unnecessary now that he didn't live at home anymore? Should I keep the landline phone that Ben had insisted on maintaining? Or was it time to simplify and rely solely on my cell phone? Marcus and Riley had helped me work through these practical challenges with patience and kindness, but they'd also started making decisions for me that I was perfectly capable of making myself. They'd arranged for grocery deliveries so I wouldn't have to face the emotional challenge of shopping alone. They'd organized my bills into an automatic payment system so I wouldn't have to think about due dates and balances. They'd even coordinated a schedule between them to ensure that someone called me every evening during the first few months, just to check in and make sure I was okay. At the time, I'd been grateful for their support. It had felt like evidence of how well I'd raised them, how naturally they'd stepped into caretaking roles when I needed them most. But looking back, I could see how those temporary arrangements had become permanent expectations. I'd never told them I was ready to resume full responsibility for my own life, and they'd never asked if I wanted to. We'd all just settled into a new normal, where they managed me rather than simply loving me. The weekly dinners at my house had started during this period too. Initially, they'd been Marcus and Riley's idea, a way to ensure I wasn't spending every Sunday alone with my grief. They'd take turns bringing groceries and cooking meals, turning my kitchen into a place of laughter and conversation again. But gradually, the responsibility had shifted back to me. I'd started planning the menus and doing the shopping and preparation myself, not because they'd asked me to, but because I'd wanted to feel useful again, wanted to contribute something meaningful to our time together. What I hadn't recognized was how those dinners had become less about family connection and more about obligation. They'd stopped being something we all looked forward to, and had become something Marcus and Riley felt they had to attend, regardless of what else was happening in their lives. When they'd started canceling more frequently or seeming distracted during our time together, I'd interpreted it as busy schedule conflicts rather than relationship fatigue. The same pattern had played out in other areas of our relationship. When Marcus had gone through his divorce 3 years ago, I'd thrown myself into supporting him with the same intensity I'd once applied to his childhood nightmares. I'd researched divorce attorneys and therapists, created meal plans to ensure he was eating properly, even offered to help him find a new apartment when he decided to move out of the home he'd shared with his ex-wife. At the time, Marcus had seemed grateful for my involvement. He'd accepted the meals and the research and the emotional support I'd offered. But now I wondered if he'd felt overwhelmed by the intensity of my help. Had he wanted space to process his divorce privately, to make his own mistakes and discoveries without his mother orchestrating every detail? Had my desire to fix his pain actually prevented him from working through it naturally? The same questions applied to my relationship with Riley. When she'd been struggling to establish her photography business 2 years ago, I'd appointed myself as her unofficial marketing manager. I'd created social media accounts to promote her work, reached out to every contact I had who might need photography services, even offered to front the money for professional equipment upgrades she'd mentioned wanting. Riley had accepted some of my help and politely declined other offers, but she'd never directly asked me to step back. Maybe she hadn't known how to tell her well-meaning mother that her assistance was becoming intrusive. Maybe she'd been afraid of hurting my feelings or seeming ungrateful for support that was genuinely intended to help. I finished my second glass of wine and moved to the living room, settling onto the couch with my phone. On impulse, I opened Instagram and navigated to Riley's account, scrolling through her recent posts with fresh eyes. Her photography was beautiful, full of the kind of emotional depth and technical skill that came from years of dedicated practice. But what struck me most was how few of her posts included me. There were photos of her and Sophie on hiking trips and date nights, pictures of Marcus and Connor at various social gatherings, shots of her work and her friends, and the places she'd traveled for photography assignments. But scrolling back through months of posts, I could find only a handful of images that included me, and most of those were from family holidays or special occasions where my absence would have been conspicuous. It wasn't that she was deliberately excluding me from her social media presence. It was that her daily life, the experiences and relationships that mattered enough to document and share, didn't include me in any significant way. I'd become background, a person who appeared in the obligatory family photos, but wasn't part of the ongoing narrative of her adult life. Marcus didn't use social media as frequently as Riley, but his LinkedIn profile told a similar story. His professional accomplishments were well documented, and there were occasional personal updates about travel or hobbies or relationship milestones. But there was no mention of family beyond his basic biographical information. No references to Sunday dinners or proud mother moments or the kind of family closeness I'd thought we maintained. Had I been living in a fantasy for the past few years? Had I convinced myself that we were close, while my children were actually maintaining the minimum level of contact necessary to avoid confrontation? The possibility was humiliating and painful, but it would explain the housewarming exclusion and the gradual decrease in spontaneous communication I'd been trying not to notice. I set my phone aside and walked to the window that looked out over my backyard. The garden Ben and I had planted together was starting to show signs of autumn, the tomato plants browning and the flower beds requiring more maintenance than I'd been giving them lately. When Ben was alive, we'd spent hours out there together, planning seasonal plantings and discussing which vegetables were producing well and which flowers attracted the most interesting butterflies. After his death, I'd continued maintaining the garden, partly because it felt like a connection to him, and partly because it gave me something productive to do with my hands when my mind was too restless for indoor activities. But I'd also started using the garden as a conversation starter with Marcus and Riley, bringing them vegetables and flowers whenever they visited, asking for their opinions about new plantings and design changes. Now I wondered if they'd seen my gardening updates as another form of emotional labor I was asking them to perform. Maybe they'd felt obligated to express enthusiasm for projects they weren't actually interested in, to accept produce they didn't really want, to participate in conversations about topics that mattered to me but not necessarily to them. The pattern was becoming clearer the more I examined it. In my effort to maintain closeness with my adult children, I'd been treating them like extensions of myself rather than independent people with their own interests and priorities. I'd assumed that what mattered to me would automatically matter to them, that my love and attention would always be welcome, regardless of the circumstances or their own emotional capacity. Ben had tried to point this out to me on several occasions, though I hadn't recognized it as criticism at the time. He'd mentioned that maybe I should wait for Marcus to ask for help with his divorce, rather than offering solutions to problems he hadn't necessarily shared. He'd suggested that Riley might appreciate space to build her business independently, without feeling like she had to incorporate my ideas or accept my financial assistance. I dismissed his concerns as typical male reluctance to get involved in emotional situations. I'd thought he didn't understand the depth of connection that was possible between mothers and children, the way that love could create a bond that transcended normal boundaries. But maybe Ben had understood something I'd been too invested to see. Maybe he'd recognized that my children needed permission to separate from me, and that by making myself indispensable to their lives, I'd made that natural separation much more difficult. The realization was painful, but also oddly liberating. If I'd created this problem through my own behavior, then maybe I could solve it by changing that behavior. Maybe the exclusion from their housewarming party wasn't a permanent rejection, but a necessary boundary, a way of communicating that our relationship needed to change before it could continue. But what did that change look like in practical terms? How did I transition from being the kind of mother who was involved in every aspect of my children's lives to being someone who supported them from a respectful distance? How did I show them that I could love them without needing to manage or fix or improve their experiences? The questions felt overwhelming, but for the first time since I'd driven away from their party, I felt something that resembled hope. Understanding the problem was the first step toward solving it, even if the solution required me to acknowledge some uncomfortable truths about my own motivations and behavior. I thought about Ben again, and the kind of father he'd been. He'd loved Marcus and Riley deeply, but he'd also trusted them to make their own decisions and learn from their own mistakes. When Marcus had struggled with math in middle school, Ben had offered to help with homework, but hadn't taken over the responsibility for Marcus's academic success. When Riley had been heartbroken over her first serious breakup in high school, Ben had listened and offered comfort but hadn't tried to fix the situation or provide solutions she hadn't asked for. Maybe Ben's approach had seemed less involved than mine, but it had also been more respectful of their autonomy. He'd parented from a place of trust rather than anxiety, confidence rather than control. His love had been steady and available without being overwhelming or intrusive. I could learn to love my children the way Ben had loved them. It would require me to step back from my role as the solver of problems and anticipator of needs, to become someone who offered support when it was requested, rather than constantly providing assistance whether it was wanted or not. It would mean accepting that there would be aspects of their lives I didn't know about, decisions they made without consulting me, experiences they navigated independently. The prospect was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. Terrifying because it meant giving up the illusion of control I'd maintained for so many years. The belief that I could protect my children from pain and disappointment through careful planning and constant vigilance. Exciting because it opened up the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and genuine choice, rather than obligation and habit. But before I could move forward with any changes, I needed to understand more clearly what had driven Marcus and Riley to exclude me so completely. The housewarming party hadn't been a subtle hint or a gentle boundary. It had been a definitive statement that my presence was unwelcome, that whatever patience they'd maintained for my intrusive behavior had finally run out. What had been the final straw? Was there a specific incident or conversation that had pushed them over the edge? Or had it been a gradual accumulation of small annoyances that had finally reached a tipping point? Understanding the catalyst would help me gauge how much work I needed to do to repair the damage, and what specific behaviors I needed to address most urgently. I decided to approach this systematically, the way I'd approach any complex problem that required careful analysis. I would go through my calendar and correspondence from the past 6 months, looking for patterns and inflection points that might explain when and why our relationship had started to deteriorate. I would examine my own behavior with the kind of honest scrutiny I'd been avoiding, acknowledging mistakes and missed signals I'd been too defensive to recognize before. And then I would figure out how to reach out to Marcus and Riley in a way that didn't repeat the same mistakes I'd been making. I would find a way to communicate that I understood I'd overstepped boundaries and was committed to doing better, without making them feel guilty for setting those boundaries in the first place. It wouldn't be easy. It would require me to admit that the kind of mother I'd thought I was and the kind of mother I'd actually been were two different things. It would mean accepting that my children's love for me didn't automatically translate into a desire for my constant presence in their lives. It would involve learning new ways of expressing care and support that honored their independence rather than undermining it. But sitting in Ben's chair, surrounded by evidence of the family life I'd treasured and nearly lost, I knew that changing was the only option if I wanted to rebuild what we'd once had. The alternative was accepting permanent estrangement from the two people I loved most in the world, and that wasn't acceptable to me. Tomorrow, I would start the difficult work of honest self-examination. Tonight, I would grieve the version of our relationship that I was going to have to let go of, the fantasy of the perfectly close family that had actually been suffocating rather than nurturing. And then I would begin the process of earning my way back into my children's lives as the person they needed me to be, rather than the person I'd assumed they wanted me to be. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would set everything in motion. I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and the calendar I'd pulled out to begin my systematic review when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda's name, and I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready to discuss what had happened at the housewarming party, wasn't prepared to explain why I'd been sitting in my car outside my children's celebration like some kind of rejected stalker. But Linda was persistent, calling back immediately when I let it go to voicemail, and I knew she wouldn't give up until she reached me. "Jessa, thank God," she said when I finally picked up. "I've been worried sick about you since yesterday. How did the party go? Did you surprise them with that casserole?" The innocent enthusiasm in her voice made my chest tighten. Linda had no idea what had transpired, no reason to suspect that my surprise visit had been anything other than a lovely family moment. She was calling to hear about hugs and gratitude and the kind of heartwarming scene she'd probably been imagining all evening. "It didn't go exactly as planned," I said carefully, not sure how much I was ready to share. "Oh no, was the casserole a disaster? I told you that recipe needs more seasoning than it calls for. Or, did you get there too early and interrupt their setup?" "Linda," I interrupted gently, "they didn't want me there. Marcus told me I wasn't invited and asked me to go home." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call might have dropped. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was different, softer and more careful. "What do you mean they didn't want you there? That's impossible. You're their mother. Apparently that doesn't guarantee an invitation to their celebrations anymore." I found myself telling Linda the whole story, from my decision to surprise them with food, to the uncomfortable conversation at their front door, to my hour of sitting in the car trying to understand what had gone wrong. She listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and disbelief at all the right moments. "There has to be some explanation," she said when I finished. "Maybe they were planning a surprise for you later. Or maybe there was some miscommunication about dates. You know how busy they've been with the move." I appreciated her loyalty, her refusal to immediately accept that my children might have deliberately excluded me. But I'd spent all night analyzing the situation, and I was past the point of making excuses for behavior that had been painfully clear. "Linda, they had 30 or 40 people there. This wasn't a small gathering that got out of hand. It was a planned celebration, and I wasn't part of it." "Then something is very wrong," she said firmly. "This isn't like Marcus and Riley. They've always been such devoted children. Remember Riley's college graduation when she insisted you sit in the front row even though it meant her friends had to find different seats?" The memory stung because it highlighted how much things had changed. Riley had been 22 then, proud to have her family there for such an important milestone. But that was 6 years ago, back when I was still welcome at her major life events. People change, Linda. Maybe they've outgrown needing their mother at every celebration. That's ridiculous. You don't outgrow loving your family. There's something else going on here, and I think you need to find out what it is. After we hung up, I sat staring at my calendar, thinking about Linda's insistence that this was unlike my children. She was right in one sense. The Marcus and Riley I thought I knew would never have been so blunt about excluding me, so comfortable with causing me obvious pain. Which meant either I'd been wrong about who they were, or something had happened to change their feelings about our relationship. I decided to start with the most recent interactions I'd had with each of them, working backward to see if I could identify the moment when things had shifted from normal family dysfunction to active avoidance. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had called about his promotion. We talked for maybe 15 minutes, and the conversation had seemed perfectly pleasant. He'd explained his new responsibilities, mentioned the salary increase, talked about how the promotion might affect his long-term career trajectory. I'd congratulated him and asked the kinds of questions any parent would ask about such good news. But now, replaying the conversation in my mind, I noticed things that hadn't registered at the time. He'd been somewhat formal in his tone, more like he was updating a colleague than sharing exciting news with his mother. When I'd suggested we celebrate with dinner at his favorite restaurant, he'd said he was really busy with the transition and maybe we could do something later. When I'd offered to cook his favorite meal at my house instead, he'd given the same vague response about being busy. At the time, I'd attributed his lack of enthusiasm to the stress of taking on new responsibilities. Now I wondered if he'd been looking for ways to avoid spending time with me even then. 2 weeks ago, I texted Riley about a photography workshop I'd seen advertised online. It was being taught by someone whose work I'd admired on Instagram, and I thought Riley might be interested in expanding her technical skills. She'd responded politely, thanking me for thinking of her but explaining that she was booked solid with client work for the next few months. Looking back, I realized this was part of a pattern that had been developing over the past year. I would send Riley information about photography opportunities, business networking events, or artistic exhibitions that I thought might interest her. She would always respond courteously, but she rarely seemed to follow up on my suggestions. At the time, I'd told myself she was just busy, or that the timing wasn't right. Now I wondered if she'd been frustrated by my constant stream of unsolicited career advice. A month ago, I'd driven to Riverside Heights to drop off some late-season tomatoes from my garden. I hadn't called ahead, just showed up at Marcus's old apartment with a bag of vegetables and the assumption that he'd be happy to see me. He'd been polite but seemed distracted, accepting the tomatoes with thanks but not inviting me inside. When I'd mentioned that I had time to help him finish packing for his move to the new house, he'd said he and Connor had everything under control. I'd felt slightly hurt by his dismissal, but had told myself he was just stressed about the logistics of moving. I'd driven home thinking I was being supportive by offering help, not realizing that my unannounced visit might have felt intrusive rather than caring. The more I examined these recent interactions, the clearer the pattern became. I'd been operating under the assumption that my presence and assistance were always welcome, that my children would naturally want to include me in their decision-making processes and celebrate their successes with me. But their responses had been increasingly polite rather than enthusiastic, grateful rather than genuinely pleased. I'd been so focused on being a good mother that I'd stopped paying attention to whether my version of good mothering was what they actually wanted or needed. But there had to be a specific catalyst, something that had pushed them from polite tolerance to active exclusion. I needed to dig deeper, to look for the moment when their patience with my behavior had finally run out. 6 weeks ago, I'd made what I'd thought was a kind gesture but now recognized as a significant overstep. Riley had mentioned in passing that she was struggling to find clients for wedding photography, that the competition in Riverside Heights was intense, and she was having trouble establishing herself in that market. I'd immediately started brainstorming solutions, reaching out to everyone I knew who might be planning a wedding or who might know someone who was. Within a week, I'd connected her with 3 potential clients, all of whom had expressed interest in her services. I'd been so proud of my networking efforts, so pleased that I could use my contacts to help launch her career in a new direction. When I'd called to tell her about the leads, I'd expected gratitude and excitement. Instead, she'd sounded overwhelmed and slightly annoyed. She'd thanked me for the connections but explained that she wasn't sure she was ready to take on wedding photography yet, that she was still developing her skills in that area and didn't want to disappoint clients with subpar work. I'd been confused by her hesitation, encouraging her to see the opportunities as a chance to learn and grow. I'd offered to help her research wedding photography techniques, to connect her with other photographers who could serve as mentors, to even assist with the business side of booking and contracts if she needed support. The more I'd pushed, the more withdrawn she'd become. Finally, she'd said she needed to think about everything and would let me know what she decided. She'd never followed up with any of the potential clients I'd found, and she'd never mentioned wedding photography again. At the time, I'd been disappointed by what I saw as her lack of initiative, her unwillingness to seize opportunities that could advance her career. Now I realized I'd completely misread the situation. Riley hadn't asked for my help finding wedding clients. She'd simply mentioned a challenge she was facing, probably looking for emotional support rather than practical solutions. By immediately jumping into problem-solving mode, I'd turned her casual comment into a pressure situation she hadn't wanted or been prepared for. Even worse, I'd essentially gone behind her back to market her services to people she didn't know, making commitments on her behalf that she'd then had to navigate diplomatically. The potential clients had probably felt confused and possibly annoyed when she didn't follow through, and Riley had been left to clean up a mess I'd created while trying to be helpful. The wedding photography incident had probably been embarrassing for her professionally and personally. It had demonstrated that I didn't trust her judgment about her own career readiness, and it had put her in the awkward position of having to reject opportunities I'd worked hard to create. No wonder she'd started being more guarded about sharing her professional challenges with me. But that was 6 weeks ago, and while it might have been the beginning of their decision to create more distance, it didn't explain the complete exclusion from their housewarming party. There had to be something more recent, something that had served as the final straw. I was still puzzling over this when my phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart leaped with the hope that it might be Marcus or Riley reaching out to explain or apologize. Instead, it was from Connor, Marcus's boyfriend, and the message was brief and confusing. "Hi, Mrs. Coleman. Could we meet for coffee sometime this week? There are some things I think you should know." I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to interpret its meaning. Connor and I had a pleasant but somewhat distant relationship. He was always polite when we interacted at family gatherings, and he'd seemed genuinely appreciative when I'd sent him a birthday card. But we'd never had a one-on-one conversation, never spent time together without Marcus present. Why would he want to meet with me now? And what kind of things did he think I should know? My first instinct was to call Marcus and ask if he knew about Connor's message, but I stopped myself before dialing. If Connor was reaching out independently, there was probably a reason he hadn't involved Marcus in the decision. Maybe he had information about why I'd been excluded from the party, insights into my children's feelings that I wouldn't be able to get from them directly. I texted back that I was available anytime and suggested we meet at Meadowbrook Cafe, a quiet place where we could talk without interruption. He responded quickly, suggesting Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. The next 2 days passed slowly, filled with speculation about what Connor might want to discuss. I found myself swinging between hope and dread, imagining scenarios that ranged from him offering to mediate a reconciliation to him delivering some terrible news about Marcus's feelings toward me. When Tuesday afternoon arrived, I was at the cafe 15 minutes early, claiming a table in the back corner where we could speak privately. Connor arrived exactly on time, looking uncharacteristically serious in dark jeans and a button-down shirt. Usually, when I saw him at family events, he was animated and cheerful, quick to laugh at Marcus's stories or engage in conversation about work or current events. Today, he seemed subdued, almost nervous. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said as he sat down, declining my offer to buy him coffee. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but after what happened Saturday night, I felt like someone needed to give you some context. "Saturday night?" I repeated, confused. "You mean the housewarming party?" He nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Marcus and Riley asked me not to say anything to you, but I don't think it's fair to leave you wondering what you did wrong. Especially since I don't think you realize how some of your recent actions have been affecting them." My stomach clenched with anxiety. What recent actions? Connor took a deep breath, clearly trying to figure out how to begin. "Do you remember about 2 months ago, when you found out Marcus and I were looking at houses together?" I nodded. Marcus had mentioned that he and Connor were considering taking their relationship to the next level by buying a place together, and I'd been thrilled by the news. It had seemed like such a positive step forward for them. Do you remember what you did after Marcus told you we were house hunting? The question caught me off guard. I'd been supportive, I thought. I'd congratulated them on the decision and offered to help in any way I could. I offered to help you look, I said slowly, starting to remember. I researched neighborhoods and sent you listings that seemed like good fits for your budget and preferences. You sent us 43 listings in 1 week, Connor said quietly. 43. With detailed notes about each property, information about school districts we don't need because we don't have children, and suggestions about which mortgage lenders we should contact. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I was trying to be helpful. House hunting is stressful, and I have experience with the local market. I know your intentions were good, Connor said gently. But Marcus and I had already been working with a real estate agent for 2 months. We had a system, a timeline, specific criteria we were using to evaluate properties. Your listings didn't match any of our actual requirements, which meant we had to spend time looking at houses we'd already eliminated, or explaining to our agent why we weren't interested in properties that seemed perfect on paper. I was beginning to understand, and the realization was mortifying. I was making more work for you, not less. That wasn't the worst part, Connor continued. The worst part was that Marcus felt like he couldn't tell you to stop. He was afraid of hurting your feelings, so he kept thanking you for each listing and pretending to consider your suggestions. It put him in this impossible position where he had to choose between managing your emotions and focusing on what was actually a really important decision for us. The full scope of my mistake was becoming clear, and it was worse than I'd imagined. I hadn't just been unhelpful. I'd been actively disruptive to one of the most significant milestones in Marcus's adult life. I'd turned what should have been an exciting process into a source of stress and conflict in his relationship. Why didn't he just tell me to back off? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Because you're his mother and he loves you, Connor said simply. Because he knows you mean well, and he didn't want to be cruel. Because you've always been so involved in his life that he didn't know how to ask for space without it feeling like a rejection. We sat in silence for a moment while I absorbed this information. I'd been proud of my research efforts, pleased with my ability to contribute to their house hunting process. I'd had no idea that my help was unwanted and counterproductive. There's more, Connor said reluctantly. The house they ended up buying, the one where they had the party Saturday night. You contacted the sellers directly. My heart sank. I remembered that phone call, how pleased I'd been with my initiative and creativity. Marcus and Connor had been outbid on 2 previous houses, and I'd thought maybe a personal appeal from a family member might give them an edge in a competitive market. I called to tell them how wonderful Marcus was, how responsible and reliable he'd be as a neighbor, I said defensively. I thought it might make their offer more appealing. It almost cost them the house, Connor said quietly. The sellers thought Marcus had sent his mother to negotiate for him because he couldn't handle the process himself. They questioned whether he was mature enough to take on a mortgage, whether there might be financial or emotional issues they should be concerned about. Their realtor had to spend an hour on the phone explaining that your call was unauthorized and didn't represent Marcus's actual approach to the transaction. I felt sick. Not only had I overstepped boundaries, I'd nearly sabotaged the most important purchase of my son's life. I'd made him look unprofessional and dependent, undermining his credibility at the worst possible moment. Marcus doesn't know that I'm telling you this, Connor said. He made me promise not to say anything because he doesn't want to make you feel bad. But I've watched him struggle with this for months, trying to figure out how to have an adult relationship with you while managing all of your efforts to help and fix and improve everything he does. I had no idea, I whispered, and I meant it. I genuinely believed that my involvement was welcome, that my experience and connections were valuable resources my children could benefit from. The housewarming party wasn't meant to hurt you, Connor continued. It was meant to be one celebration where Marcus and Riley could just be proud of their accomplishments without having to manage anyone else's emotions or expectations. They wanted to enjoy their friends and their new neighborhood without worrying about whether they were being grateful enough, or inclusive enough, or accommodating enough. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on being included that I'd never considered whether my presence might be emotionally exhausting for my children. I'd assumed that love meant always wanting to be together, never realizing that sometimes love required giving people space to exist independently. What can I do to fix this? I asked, though I was afraid the answer might be that it was too late, that I'd damaged our relationships beyond repair. Connor smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and I caught a glimpse of the warm, optimistic person Marcus had fallen in love with. The fact that you're asking that question instead of getting defensive is a really good start. We talked for another hour, with Connor explaining other incidents I'd forgotten or misinterpreted. The time I'd reorganized Riley's photography equipment while she was out of town, thinking I was being helpful but actually making it impossible for her to find anything when she returned. The time I'd corrected Marcus's dinner order at a restaurant because I thought the dish he'd chosen was too spicy for his sensitive stomach, not realizing that his tastes had changed since childhood, and that he was perfectly capable of making his own food choices. Each example was a small thing in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone who couldn't step back and let her adult children make their own decisions, even about the most basic aspects of their lives. I'd been treating them like teenagers who needed guidance and protection, not recognizing that they'd grown into capable adults who had their own ways of doing things. By the time Connor and I parted ways, I understood why Marcus and Riley had felt the need to exclude me so dramatically. It hadn't been cruelty, it had been self-preservation. They'd reached a point where they couldn't enjoy their own lives because they were constantly worried about managing my feelings and expectations. The drive home gave me time to process everything Connor had shared, and by the time I reached Pine Valley, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't undo the mistakes I'd made, but I could acknowledge them and commit to doing better. I could learn to love my children in ways that honored their independence, rather than undermining it. But first, I needed to figure out how to apologize for years of behavior I'd never realized was problematic, and how to rebuild trust that had been eroded by the best of intentions applied in the worst possible ways. I spent 3 days crafting what I thought would be the perfect apology letter. Draft after draft filled my trash can as I struggled to find words that acknowledged my mistakes without sounding defensive, that expressed genuine remorse without begging for forgiveness I might not deserve. Each attempt felt either too dramatic or too casual, too long or too brief, too focused on my feelings or not honest enough about my actions. Finally, I abandoned the letter idea entirely. Written words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what needed to be said, and besides, hiding behind carefully crafted sentences seemed like another way of avoiding direct confrontation with the consequences of my behavior. If I was serious about changing our relationship dynamic, I needed to start by having the kind of honest, uncomfortable conversation I'd been avoiding for years. On Friday morning, I called Marcus's office. His assistant, a young woman named Jessica, who'd always been friendly when we'd met at company events, seemed surprised to hear from me. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Coleman. Marcus is in meetings all morning, but I can have him call you back this afternoon. Actually, I was wondering if you could help me with something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know he's been working late this week because of his new promotion responsibilities. What time does he usually wrap up on Fridays? He's been staying until around 7 most nights this week trying to get caught up on everything." "Perfect. Could you let him know I'll be in the lobby at 7 tonight? There's something important I need to discuss with him, and it can't wait for a more convenient time." I could hear the confusion in Jessica's voice, but she agreed to pass along the message. Marcus would have several hours to prepare for my arrival, to decide whether he wanted to see me or find an excuse to leave early. But either way, I would be there, ready to have the conversation we should have had months ago. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I cleaned my already clean house, organized closets that didn't need organizing, and tried to rehearse what I would say without over-planning, to the point where my words would sound scripted. By 6:30, I was sitting in my car outside Marcus's office building, watching other employees leave for the weekend and wondering if I was making another terrible mistake. At exactly 7 o'clock, Marcus emerged from the elevator looking tired but professional in his dark suit and loosened tie. He spotted me immediately through the glass doors of the lobby, and I watched his expression shift from surprise to resignation to something that might have been relief. He pushed through the doors and walked over to my car, sliding into the passenger seat without being invited. "Mom," he said simply, and there was more weariness in that single word than I'd heard in years of our polite, surface-level conversations. "I talked to Connor," I said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "He told me about the house hunting, about the phone call to your sellers, about all the ways I've been making your life more complicated when I thought I was being helpful. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the headrest. I asked him not to do that. I'm glad he did. I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't trying to protect my feelings. I turned in my seat to face him fully. Marcus, I am so sorry. I had no idea that my help was causing you stress instead of relieving it. I thought I was being a good mother, but I was actually making it harder for you to be an independent adult. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, dealing with a problem too big for him to handle alone. Vulnerability, exhaustion, the kind of emotional fatigue that comes from carrying a burden for too long. I didn't know how to tell you to stop, he said quietly. Every time I tried to set a boundary, you'd get this hurt look on your face, or you'd explain how you were just trying to help, and I'd end up feeling guilty for not appreciating your efforts. It was easier to just accept your help and deal with the complications privately. The truth of his words cut deep because I recognized the dynamic he was describing. I had been putting him in impossible positions, making him choose between his own needs and my feelings. I'd been the parent who claimed to want honesty but punished it with emotional reactions whenever it was offered. That must have been exhausting, I said, and I meant it. Having to manage my emotions on top of everything else you were dealing with. It was, he admitted, and there was relief in his voice at being able to say it out loud. And it wasn't just me. Riley has been struggling with the same thing, but she's been afraid to bring it up because she saw how hard it was for me to navigate. I thought about all the times Riley had politely declined my suggestions or changed the subject when I started offering unsolicited advice. I'd interpreted her responses as disinterest or busy schedules, never realizing she was trying to create boundaries without hurting my feelings. The housewarming party, I said. That was your way of taking a break from managing my emotions. Marcus nodded. We wanted one celebration that was just about us and our friends and our accomplishment. We didn't want to spend the evening worrying about whether you were happy or included or properly appreciated. We just wanted to enjoy our new house without it becoming another opportunity for you to fix or improve or enhance the experience. His honesty was painful but also liberating. For the first time in months, we were having a real conversation about real issues, instead of dancing around problems neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I understand why you excluded me, I said. I don't like it, but I understand it. What I don't understand is how to fix this. How do I show you that I can love you without trying to control or improve your life? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the windshield at the empty office parking lot. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful but not unkind. I don't think you can show us that, Mom. I think you have to learn how to actually do it. And that's going to take time and practice and probably some professional help. Professional help? Therapy, he said bluntly. You need to figure out why you feel compelled to fix and manage everything. Why you can't just be present with people without trying to improve their situations. This isn't just about Riley and me. This is about patterns you've had for as long as I can remember. The suggestions stung, but I couldn't argue with his assessment. I'd been trying to solve other people's problems since my children were toddlers, maybe since before they were born. It had become such an automatic response that I couldn't imagine how to have relationships without it. What if I can't change? I asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath all my self-reflection. What if this is just who I am, and trying to be different feels fake or forced? Then we'll probably continue to have a relationship that feels like work instead of joy, Marcus said sadly. And eventually that relationship will become so draining that we'll stop making the effort to maintain it. The stark honesty of his words was exactly what I needed to hear, even though it made my chest ache with grief for what we'd already lost and fear for what we might lose in the future. I want to try, I said. I want to learn how to be the kind of mother you and Riley actually need, not the kind I think you should want. Good, Marcus said, and for the first time since he'd gotten in the car, he smiled slightly. Because we want you in our lives, Mom. We just need you to be there differently than you have been. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the conversation and its implications. I felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified, grateful for his honesty, but overwhelmed by the work ahead of me. Can I ask you something? I said eventually. Of course. When you were growing up, did I do this then too? The fixing and managing and problem solving? Marcus considered the question seriously. Yes, but it felt different when we were kids. We actually needed a lot of the help you gave us. And we didn't have enough life experience to know when your involvement was crossing lines. As adults, we can see the difference between support we've asked for and assistance we don't actually need. That made sense, but it also raised another question I was afraid to ask but needed to understand. Are there good memories too? Times when my involvement was genuinely helpful or wanted? Marcus's expression softened, and I saw a glimpse of the affection that had been hidden beneath months of frustration and exhaustion. Of course there are. You were an amazing mother in so many ways, Mom. You made us feel loved and safe and supported. You celebrated our successes and comforted us through disappointments. You taught us to be kind and thoughtful and to care about other people's feelings. Those things haven't changed, and they're not going away. His reassurance meant more to me than he probably realized. In the midst of confronting all my mistakes, I'd started to wonder if I'd been a completely terrible parent. If everything I'd done had been motivated by selfish needs rather than genuine love. The problem isn't that you love us too much, Marcus continued. The problem is that your love has gotten tangled up with anxiety and control, so it doesn't feel like love anymore. It feels like pressure. That distinction was crucial, and I knew I'd need to remember it as I worked to change my patterns. The goal wasn't to love my children less. It was to love them more cleanly, more simply, without all the complicated expectations and interventions I'd been layering on top of basic affection and support. Will you tell Riley about this conversation? I asked. Only if you want me to. She needs to hear these things from you directly, but it might help if she knows you're working on understanding what went wrong. I nodded, already dreading but also anticipating the similar conversation I'd need to have with my daughter. Riley's communication style was different from Marcus's, more emotional and less analytical, which meant our discussion would probably be harder but potentially more cathartic. There's something else, Marcus said as he reached for the door handle. Something Connor probably didn't tell you because he doesn't know about it. My stomach clenched with anxiety. What? Dad used to worry about this too. He tried to talk to you about it a few times, but you always got defensive or changed the subject. He was concerned that you were going to have trouble letting Riley and me become independent adults. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Ben had seen this problem developing and had tried to warn me, but I'd been too invested in my own version of good parenting to hear him. How many opportunities had I missed to address these issues before they became serious enough to damage my relationships with my children? What did he say exactly? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He said you had trouble distinguishing between being needed and being wanted. He worried that when we didn't need your help anymore, you'd try to create situations where your assistance seemed necessary, and that would push us away instead of keeping us close. Ben's insight was painfully accurate, and it explained so much about my behavior over the past few years. After his death, I'd lost my primary relationship with someone who needed me daily, and I'd unconsciously tried to fill that void by making myself indispensable to Marcus and Riley. But unlike a marriage between equals, my relationship with my adult children couldn't be sustained by making myself necessary to their daily functioning. He was right, I said simply. He usually was about people stuff, Marcus agreed. But he also said he thought you'd figure it out eventually, that you were too smart and too caring to let these patterns continue once you understood how they were affecting us. The vote of confidence from beyond the grave brought tears to my eyes. Ben had believed I could change, had trusted that my love for our children would ultimately motivate me to do the hard work of examining and modifying my own behavior. I'm going to make an appointment with a therapist, I said, this week. And I'm going to be honest about what's been happening, even if it makes me look bad. That's a good start, Marcus said. And Mom, thank you for being willing to have this conversation. I know it wasn't easy to hear these things, but it gives me hope that we can figure out how to have a better relationship going forward. He got out of the car then, but he leaned down to the window before walking away. I love you, he said. We both do, that's never been the question. As I drove home, I felt emotionally drained, but also oddly hopeful. The conversation with Marcus had been difficult and humbling, but it had also been the most honest exchange we'd had in years. For the first time, I understood exactly what I needed to work on, and had a clear sense of what my children needed from me. But understanding the problem and solving it were two different things. I had decades of ingrained patterns to unlearn, reflexes and assumptions that would take conscious effort to overcome. I would need professional help to untangle the anxiety and need for control that had been driving my behavior. And I would need patience from Marcus and Riley as I learned new ways of relating to them. The next morning, I called 3 therapists whose names I found through my insurance provider's website. The first 2 couldn't see new patients for several weeks, but the third, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had a cancellation and could meet with me the following Tuesday. "What brings you to therapy at this point in your life?" she asked when I called to schedule the appointment. "I've been trying to help my adult children, but apparently I've been making their lives more difficult instead of easier," I said. "I need to figure out how to love them without trying to control or fix everything they do." "That's a very insightful way to frame the issue," Dr. Mitchell said. "It sounds like you're ready to do some serious work on examining your patterns and motivations." I was ready, or at least I was committed to getting ready. My relationship with Marcus and Riley was too important to lose to my own inability to change, and I owed it to Ben's memory to become the mother he believed I could be. The work wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months I felt like I was moving in the right direction. I had a clear understanding of the problem, a plan for addressing it, and children who were willing to give me the chance to do better. That had to be enough to build on. 6 months passed after that devastating confrontation in our entryway, and the silence between Marcus and us stretched on like an endless winter. David and I had fallen into new routines that didn't include weekly phone calls from our son or impromptu family dinners. The absence of Marcus's presence in our lives was a constant ache, like mourning someone who was still alive but had chosen to become a stranger. I threw myself into my volunteer work at the community center with renewed passion, spending extra hours helping adult learners navigate their journey toward literacy. There was something deeply satisfying about working with people who genuinely appreciated guidance and support, a stark contrast to the rejection I had experienced from my own family. David picked up additional substitute teaching assignments, finding comfort in the classroom environment where his knowledge and experience were valued. Our friends and neighbors, who had known Marcus since he was a child, would occasionally ask about him with the innocent expectation that families naturally stayed connected. I learned to deflect those questions with vague responses about everyone being busy, unwilling to expose the painful truth of our estrangement to people who couldn't possibly understand how a loving family could fragment so completely. Then, on a crisp October morning, everything changed. I was preparing lesson materials for my afternoon literacy class when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and for a moment I stared at it in disbelief. After 6 months of complete silence, my son was finally reaching out. "Hello, Marcus," I said carefully, unsure of what tone to strike after so much time had passed. "Mom." His voice sounded different somehow, strained and uncertain, in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager facing a difficult situation. "I need to talk to you and Dad. Could I come over?" The request was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. "Of course," I managed finally. "When would you like to come?" "Is now okay?" he asked, and I could hear something that sounded almost like desperation in his voice. "I know it's short notice, but this can't wait." An hour later, David and I sat in our living room waiting for Marcus to arrive. We had positioned ourselves in the same chairs where we used to have countless family conversations throughout his childhood and adolescence, back when our home was a place of warmth and open communication, rather than a battlefield for hurtful accusations. When Marcus knocked on the door, David and I exchanged a look of mutual apprehension before I went to answer it. Our son stood on the front porch alone this time, without Elena's intimidating presence to reinforce his resolve. He looked tired, older than his 32 years, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Thank you for letting me come," he said quietly, as I stepped aside to let him in. The formal politeness in his voice was heartbreaking, a reminder of how far we had drifted from the easy intimacy we once shared. He took a seat across from us, and for a long moment nobody spoke. I studied his face, searching for clues about what had prompted this unexpected visit. There was something different about his demeanor, a vulnerability that had been completely absent during our last confrontation. "I owe you both an apology," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about that day when Elena and I came here, about the things I said to you, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved." I felt my heart beginning to race with a mixture of hope and caution. After months of hurt and rejection, the possibility of reconciliation seemed almost too good to believe. "I was angry about the funeral," he continued, "but more than that, I was scared. Elenina had been so upset about you being there, and her mother was furious. I felt caught between my family and hers, and I handled it in the worst possible way." David leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but guarded. "What's changed, Marcus? Why are you here now?" Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the anxious child he had once been. "Elena and I are separated," he said quietly. "She moved out 3 weeks ago." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me. Part of me was genuinely sorry that his marriage had failed, despite everything that had happened between us. But another part felt a guilty sense of relief, that the person who had systematically poisoned our family relationships was no longer controlling Marcus's decisions. "I'm sorry to hear that," David said, and I could tell he meant it. Marriage ending is always difficult, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus nodded, his eyes focused on his hands folded in his lap. "The thing is, it wasn't just the separation that made me realize what I'd done. It was something Elena said right before she left." He looked up at us for the first time since arriving, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "She told me that she had never respected you, that she had always seen you as beneath our social level, and that she was glad I had finally learned to put you in your proper place." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though they merely confirmed what I had suspected for years. Hearing Elena's true feelings articulated so bluntly, and knowing that our son had been exposed to that kind of toxic thinking throughout his marriage, made me understand just how systematically our family bonds had been undermined. "She was proud of the way you excluded us from Robert's funeral," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Marcus's face crumpled with shame. "She said it was a perfect example of how I had learned to prioritize the right relationships and manage problematic family members." Those were her exact words, Mom. Problematic family members. I felt tears beginning to form in my own eyes, both from the pain of knowing how Elena truly viewed us and from the relief of finally hearing Marcus acknowledge what had really been happening in our family. "The worst part," Marcus continued, his voice breaking, "was realizing that I had let her convince me you were the problem. I started seeing your love and concern as interference. I began viewing your desire to be included in family events as attention-seeking behavior. She had me so turned around that I actually believed you were being unreasonable for wanting to attend Robert's funeral." David reached over and took my hand, a gesture of support that reminded me how fortunate I was to have a partner who had remained constant throughout this ordeal. "Robert loved you both," Marcus said, looking directly at me. "He used to tell Elena and me all the time how lucky I was to have parents who had raised me with such strong values. He would have been horrified to know that you were excluded from his funeral, and even more horrified to know that I was the one who excluded you." The mention of Robert brought back all the grief I had been carrying, not just for his death but for the way his memorial had been corrupted by Elena's social machinations and Marcus's willingness to go along with them. "Why didn't you see it at the time?" I asked, genuinely trying to understand how my son had become so lost. "You knew Robert cared about us. You knew we had a right to be there." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with his own question. "Elena was very good at making her preferences seem reasonable," he said finally. "She would present things in a way that made opposition seem selfish or inappropriate. And I wanted so badly to fit into her world, to be worthy of the life she offered, that I convinced myself her perspective was more sophisticated than yours." The admission was painful but also illuminating. I began to understand that Marcus hadn't consciously chosen to hurt us. He had been gradually manipulated into believing that his parents' values and feelings were less important than his wife's social preferences. "I lost myself," he continued. "I became someone I don't recognize, someone who could lie to his parents about a funeral and then blame them for being hurt by that lie. I'm not sure I can ever forgive myself for the way I treated you. I looked at my son, seeing for the first time in years the vulnerable, caring person I had raised. The arrogance and coldness that had characterized his behavior during our last confrontation were gone, replaced by genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make amends. "We're your parents, Marcus," I said softly. "We love you unconditionally, even when you make mistakes that hurt us deeply. The question isn't whether we can forgive you. The question is whether you can learn from this experience and make sure it never happens again." David nodded in agreement. "What Elena did was wrong, but she couldn't have succeeded in dividing our family if you hadn't allowed it to happen. If you want to rebuild our relationship, we need to understand that you won't let anyone else manipulate you into treating us with disrespect again." Marcus met our eyes directly for the first time during his visit. "I swear to both of you that I will never let anyone come between our family again. I don't know if I can undo all the damage I've caused, but I want to try." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, stretching well into the evening as we began the difficult process of rebuilding trust and understanding. Marcus told us about the gradual way Elena had isolated him from us, how she had reframed every interaction to make us seem intrusive or inappropriate. He described the constant pressure he felt to choose sides, and how Elena's threats to leave him had made him prioritize his marriage over his relationship with us. I shared my own experience of watching him drift away, of feeling helpless as Elena's influence grew stronger and our connection grew weaker. David talked about the pain of seeing his son become someone who could speak to his parents with such cruelty, and how difficult it had been to maintain hope that the real Marcus was still there somewhere. As the evening wore on, I began to see glimpses of the son I remembered. His laugh, which had been missing from our interactions for years, returned as we shared memories of happier times. His genuine interest in our lives and activities, which had been replaced by polite but distant inquiries, reasserted itself as he asked detailed questions about my volunteer work and David's teaching experiences. But I also remained cautious, knowing that rebuilding our relationship would take time and consistent effort. Marcus would have to prove through his actions, not just his words, that he had truly learned from this painful experience. Over the following months, Marcus made good on his promise to repair our family bonds. He began calling regularly again, not just to check in but to have real conversations about our lives and his own struggles with divorce and starting over. He started joining us for Sunday dinners, something that hadn't happened in over 2 years. Most importantly, he began making decisions that prioritized our relationship rather than external social pressures. When Patricia attempted to maintain contact with him after his separation from Elena, he politely but firmly declined her invitations, explaining that he needed to focus on rebuilding relationships with people who had always loved him unconditionally. The divorce proceedings were difficult and sometimes contentious, with Elena attempting to claim assets and support that Marcus felt were unreasonable. But throughout that stressful period, he never once suggested that we should avoid discussing the situation, or that our opinions weren't welcome. Instead, he sought our advice and support, treating us like the family we had always been rather than inconvenient outsiders to be managed. One evening in late spring, almost a year after that first reconciliation conversation, Marcus brought us to Robert's grave to pay our respects together. We stood quietly beside the headstone, and Marcus offered a heartfelt apology to Robert's memory for the way he had dishonored his funeral by excluding people who loved him. "He would forgive you," I said, watching as Marcus placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave. Robert understood that people sometimes make mistakes when they're under pressure. What would matter to him is that you learned from the experience and chose to do better. As we walked back to our cars that evening, Marcus stopped and turned to face David and me. "I know I can never completely undo the hurt I caused," he said, "but I want you both to know that losing Elena was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it helped me remember who I really am and what truly matters in life." 6 months later, Marcus met Sarah, a kindergarten teacher who shared his values and appreciated the importance of family relationships. When he brought her to meet us, I was struck by the difference in his demeanor compared to how he had been with Elena. He was relaxed, genuinely happy, and eager for us to get to know the woman who had captured his heart. Sarah was warm, unpretentious, and genuinely interested in getting to know us as people, rather than evaluating our social status. She asked thoughtful questions about our volunteer work and teaching experiences, and she laughed at David's terrible jokes, with the same genuine amusement that had always endeared him to people who valued character over sophistication. When Marcus and Sarah announced their engagement 2 years later, they insisted that David and I be intimately involved in planning the wedding. Unlike the elaborate country club affair that had marked Marcus's first marriage, this celebration was held in our church with a reception in the fellowship hall. It was simple, heartfelt, and focused on bringing together people who genuinely cared about the couple, rather than impressing anyone with displays of wealth or status. As I watched Marcus exchange vows with Sarah, I thought about the journey our family had taken to reach this point. The pain of those years when Elena's influence had poisoned our relationships seemed like a distant nightmare compared to the joy and connection we now shared. Marcus had learned the hard way that authentic relationships built on love and mutual respect were infinitely more valuable than social connections based on superficial appearances and materialistic values. The experience had changed all of us in profound ways. I had learned to stand up for my own worth and dignity, even when doing so meant risking relationships I desperately wanted to preserve. David had discovered reserves of strength and patience he hadn't known he possessed, and Marcus had gained wisdom about the difference between people who love you for who you are and people who only value you for what you can provide or represent. Today, our family is stronger than it has ever been, built on a foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and hard-won wisdom about what truly matters in life. We still gather for Sunday dinners, but now they include Sarah and the grandchildren who call me Grandma Sophia and climb onto David's lap to hear stories about his teaching adventures. Sometimes I think about Elena and Patricia, wondering if they ever reflect on the damage their social pretensions caused to a loving family. But mostly I focus on the future we're building together, grateful for the painful lessons that ultimately made us all better people and brought us closer together than we had ever been before. The text message that started this whole ordeal, "The funeral is private, his wife's family doesn't want you there," now seems like a blessing in disguise. It forced us to confront problems that had been festering for years and ultimately led to a stronger, more authentic family bond based on truth, rather than the careful avoidance of difficult conversations. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even from people you love deeply. By standing up for our dignity and attending Robert's funeral despite being told we weren't welcome, David and I set boundaries that ultimately helped our son remember his own values and choose a path that led back to us. Our family's story serves as a reminder that love alone isn't always enough to maintain healthy relationships. Sometimes you have to fight for those relationships, stand up for what's right, and refuse to let toxic influences destroy the bonds that matter most. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is showing them through your own example what it looks like to live with integrity and self-respect, even when doing so comes at a significant cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.